I think I realized early on the Civic Center would be a big decision for the city for generations to come, and it ought to be done right.
I was just always very happy I'd had a chance to be part of that project.
The Civic Center's story began in the early 1940s on a 33-acre piece of land on the northwestern end of Fairfield. The establishment of the Fairfield Sassoon Army Air Base brought in thousands of military personnel to the region, and housing soon became a top priority. To alleviate this, the Waterman Park Federal Housing Project was built. Opening in November of 1943, 40 buildings provided 160 family apartments, along with 5 dormitory structures that housed 216 men. After the war, through the leadership of Mayor Ellis Godfrey, the city purchased Waterman Park from the government in November of 1953. And City Hall offices were relocated into the Recreation and Cafeteria building. Rents from the housing units were collected by the city, and funds were set aside for a future civic center.
I always have a warm place in my heart thinking about Waterman Park and the neighborhood that it was, and the positive impact it had on me as a child. And also for our family, as a young family, and my father as a young airman, and having a nice, safe, close neighborhood.
Everything was there, the police department, paid your water bill, everything was right there in the middle of Waterman Park. It was a special place for those who lived there. You know, you met new friends. The war was over, and these areas didn't have housing for civilians, much less, you know, with the military. So having that old military housing was a lifesaver for many people.
So by the mid-60s, Fairfield was a growing city. We had grown to about 40,000, and we had outgrown our civic facilities at that time. And the leaders of the community knew that it was time that we started looking for something new. And we had this property with a future civic center in mind. And we could have hired an architect. We could have just, put out an RFP or an RFQ, brought in some credentials and said, yeah, let's pick this person and let's see what we get. Well, the leaders of the city said, no, we want to think bigger. We really want something grand and spectacular. We want to see the best.
In March of 1967, the City Council determined that an architectural competition be held to select an architect for the project. Invitations were sent to all registered architects residing in California.
The terms of the competition were that the proposal was to include a fairly elaborate civic center complex. At the end of the summer, the leader of the design competition put together a jury of 5 professionals, including a collection of professional architects, and Alan Witt, the city's mayor.
The 5-person jury selected the top 4 finalists in December of 1967.
We wanted the competitors to really, put their best effort in. And what we said was the top four, whoever the top four are, numbers 2, 3, and 4 are going to get a cash prize. And it was more than $1,000. And in the end, a gentleman named Robert Hawley, an architect out of San Francisco, put together the winning design.
It was the idea of combining buildings and nature. That was what the whole thing was about. And to treat it as a city hall in a park. Use as few materials as possible to keep it as a unity. And brick and concrete and glass were the three materials that were used in the whole Civic Center. And then the center, put a lake, and that you're taking up as little space as possible, 3 acres out of 33, but it's the main focus. It's the center. It's like the target.
We didn't know it'd be 5 buildings until the jury selected a plan showing 5 buildings and a lake. We never would have thought of the lake. It was a great idea. And it was maximizing the space that had been made available that most cities can't.
If you look at the plans, and they're conceptual, they're not extremely detailed, but lots of forms, and you see where all the buildings fit together. The portions of it that have been built to date look nearly identical to what he had put together.
Well, there's a dramatic picture in New Year's Day, 1968 Daily Republic. There's a sign, it's Lincoln Street, the corner of Lincoln Street and Waterman Street. And so what they did was they tore down all the units and they burned them. And so you see the signs intersecting, and you see these flames behind it. And a lot of people who grew up in Waterman Park, who are still in Fairfield, remember that. And it wasn't really built to last for decades as it did. And so by the 60s or so, it was kind of in disrepair, but also the city was growing. It kind of outgrew it. So there was this whole push to make it into a civic center, a true civic center. So that's when this whole committee was formed. The Forward Fairfield Committee was formed to kind of sell it to the public. There was a lot of prominent Fairfielders were on that committee. One of them was being Robbie Burr Berger, who a couple of years after that became the first female Fairfield City Council member. So yeah, their job was to let them know, hey, we kind of need this thing, and literally had to sell it because there was gonna have to be a bond measure to pay for it. So that was their job, to let people know about it. And they did a great job, obviously, because it's here now.
The Civic Center bond measure passed with over 79% of community support on November 5th, 1968. And construction began on the Civic Center Complex the following year.
The City Hall people moved in November of 1970. The police department was actually occupied in April of 1970 because the police department building was torn down when the first half of the lake started to be graded. The old photos, of course, in 71 show all these tiny little saplings, the trees. Now that everything's grown up, the landscape is much more beautiful than it was originally. I could see from the size of the facility that there was a lot of planning put into it. I think one of the driving forces was B. Gale Wilson. Mr. Wilson was a visionary and did more for the city than you can ever imagine.
The Civic Center Complex was a focal point for community pride, for a community that was hungry for something as the center place.
They had a dedication right here. It was like 650 Fairfielders came to it. Scarlet Brigade was here. The keynote speaker was U.S. Senator John V. Tunney. So when Tunney gives his speech, he talks about this being a measure of the pride the city has. And Loyal Hanson, who was the mayor at the time, said that they were only temporary custodians of this. So they knew back then this was a thing that was built to last. And here we are 50 years later.
Well, I think B. Gale Wilson's vision was a very well thought out one, a place where people can come together in peace for not only political and governmental activities, but also for cultural events. And the cultural events run that wide range of opportunities. And the notion that the Civic Center is a focal point for the city of Fairfield is quite clear.
I love the way that nature took over the years and all the trees. And I think the Civic Center just got better every year. It was a wonderful city to work for because they were very supportive and they gave it everything they had.